Hello, Northstar here, and welcome to another Singularity Let's Play. I hope you folks are doing well. Um, I am stressed somewhat, but that's not unusual with long COVID. For those new to my channel, I'm disabled with long COVID, and well, the disease sucks. It puts a lot of stress on me with a lot of minor health issues and being basically pushed into the shadows of society. It's funny, I read some articles not talking about fear of people with long COVID being pushed into the shadows of society, nor it's like, what are you talking about? It's not something that might happen, it's something that's already happened. Um, Society prefers to ignore this disease. The government prefers to not go any extra effort or acknowledge the huge shortcomings of things like the Social Security disability insurance system, which insurance, air quote, this is part of neoliberalism. Oh, everything is insurance. It's personally managed. It's your own. Well, the government's just trying to portray it more like it's a public option insurance thing than a social safety net. Meanwhile, creating rules and regulations on it that no person would ever want on a private insurance. Like, okay, I worked for a university while I was in grad school. For the university I was going to grad school for, as TA, and then later like as an usher at a event hall, and these jobs would have paid into payroll tax and earned SSDI credit if they were private sector, or if I was working for the university and I wasn't a grad student. But because it was for the university and I was a grad student, it was exempted for payroll tax, and so it didn't contribute to SSDI, and so I don't have enough credits when I would have enough credits with those jobs, which is ridiculous. And I actually graded tests as a job in the private sector later, and I earned SSDI credit for that job, just not for grading as a TA, like a graduate TA ship, which is much more involved than like what undergrad TAs might do. Graduate students are expected, a lot more is expected of them as TAs, or at least was at the university I went to. And being like a ticket collector, that's absolutely a job. You go with like collect tickets at a convention center or a football stadium or something. You do that job. It might be a sucky job, but it pays in payroll tax in the private sector. So why shouldn't it for a university? Yeah, they created this rule. It was in the mid '90s, thanks to Newt Gingrich, to fuck people over and make it harder for young people to earn their SSDI credits. So if they're disabled young, you get this population of people who would have been eligible for SSDI and then aren't because they don't have enough credits, especially people who went to grad school. And, that's the problem. You get people, say, who got COVID when they were in grad school. I was already somewhat out of grad school, this partly due to getting stranded in a rural area for a while, and where there weren't jobs in my field, and being considered overqualified for the jobs I applied for, so a period of unemployment. Like, I was marginal on credits only because of this stupid rule pushed out. But what if I had been younger? What if I had been just finishing up PhD, let's say, and I got disabled? I would never have had the work credits. Should I not be able to survive because I got disabled young with the coronavirus? Long COVID, there's like 7-year-olds who are disabled long COVID. It happens to people of all ages. So this is part of poking the social safety net full of holes and denying that it's even a social safety net. So that's on my mind, as well as I've had, then the fallback is, rely on family. Except I've had pretty sucky treatment from family who's made major life events like my graduations, or I even sometimes my birthday's about them and not about me. Abusive father. It's a long list of problems from them, but I haven't been able to rely on them nearly as much as I should have been able to for help in this situation. And they have, limited resources, and none of that's my fault. Um, So I'm doing this YouTube channel, trying to get to where I can monetize it, survive, you know. Um, anyways, enough about me. You guys got your own stuff in your own lives, and I don't mean to sit here and just talk about myself. Some people may find it relatable. I hope you do find it relatable, you know. Um, I try to give you guys something to think about, to talk about, to connect with. Um, craziness with Trump is going on. If any of you watch Second Thought, I've been watching the guy who does that. He seems to be drifting to the right. Not like he's going brain rotted right wing ideology, but it feels like he's maybe being pressured to moderate his views. He has a daughter, that guy, so maybe the security state is threatening his daughter's future, or maybe uh, it's just parents starting to worry that there'll be a retaliation against his daughter when she's older for him having leftist views, or um, maybe it can be this old game where the left, the thing that was most glaring is moderating his stance on Ukraine, and that can be a case of, I've noticed this pattern before. The left insists on something that's true for a long time, and then someone on the right says that thing, and suddenly, rather than say, okay, well, we've got a little common ground with like these far right people, they're assholes, and we shouldn't agree with them, but they just happen to, stop clock twice a day, then they'll suddenly change. A lot of people on the left will suddenly change their rhetoric, maybe because they think they're what they're saying is going to be met anyways. But when I'm talking about here, partly he's talking about, well, Zelensky, like he is a dictator, which he is. I mean, he's not. He banned opposition parties in Ukraine and such, and Trump called him a dictator. And suddenly, people on the left are no longer calling Zelensky a dictator, which he has always been. He's been someone who banned opposition parties, grabbed control of media, uses the state security apparatus to suppress dissenters, beat, torture, disappear people, that kind of stuff. He is a dictator. He may not be the worst dictator in the world, but he's a dictator. He may even not be as bad as Putin, but he is still not some shining bastion of even liberal democracy. And by I mean liberal bourgeois democracy, which takes most power out of the hands of ordinary people, gives them no control over their economic futures, lets the rich buy most politics, but one of its few and best cases, sometimes redeeming features, sometimes at least respecting this like right to freedom of speech of ordinary people and the illusion of a free press, though it's really just, voices for whatever rich people have the money to buy. But, but that's not even what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, shutting down opposition newspapers and opposition political parties and accusing it of being, Russian tools just to take control of the political scene, like beating protesters, forced drafts. These kind of things are not even the kind of thing you normally expect of liberal democracy. You expect, rich assholes buying politicians, tax cuts for the rich, deregulation, turning a blind eye to like polluting the waterways. So-called liberal democracy isn't really democracy at all, but even that form of oligarchy usually has rules that Zelensky has very much been violating. Um, uh, and to hear leftists suddenly stop saying at the moment they would have some common ground with Trump is a little bit off-putting. Like, stick by your principles, stick by the facts. It doesn't matter if some people that you find despicable come to agree with you or not. The point is whether the things you're saying are true or not. Intellectual integrity, which unfortunately is something you don't find a lot of outside of, well, a few academics. This is not to be confused with academic integrity, by the way, which is like not plagiarizing. No, I mean intellectual integrity, where you'll go where the evidence leads you. You may be careful about whose evidence you accept or cast a suspicious eye if the access to information is being controlled about whether you should really believe things based on evidence you're allowed to see. But um, with certain exemptions, you know, and caveats for things like that, you still need to go where the evidence takes you. That's what intellectual integrity is. You find that in some academics. I say some because I've seen professors who will just refuse to admit they were wrong. I had one who we got into debate about what does it mean to increase something by 100%, 200%, 300%, because it was an exam question. And there was increase something by 300%, increase something by 200%. And the correct answer was that the value should be tripled, except the professor marked increase by 300% is the correct thing, which would mean that the value of something was quadrupled. This was by way of thing in biology, but it was like um, a bit of physiology in a medical sciences program. So um, there's actually calculation in some of that. And it had to do with blood pressures, I remember correctly. So fluid dynamics, very mathematical. It was very clear what the correct answer, and the professor wasn't arguing about what the correct value should be in the end. He was fully agreeing with me that the correct value should be the final value is triple, but he was trying to claim that increase by 300% means increase to 300% of the final value. That's not what that means. If I increase something by 100%, if you use that logic, it would mean you didn't change the value at all. No, it doesn't. Increasing by 100% means you double the value. Using his logic, you would increase by 100% would be a meaningless phrase, but it's not. Which I tried to explain to him, but he just refused, because he lacked this professor lacked intellectual integrity, lacked the ability to go where the evidence leads him, even if the evidence is showing him that he was mistaken about something and just swallowing his pride. So not even all professors are like that, but it seems to be extremely rare outside of academia. Sometimes academics have intellectual integrity. Very few people in the political sphere do. You get used to people with waffling and changing their views based on who agrees with them, and it's kind of, as someone with a lot of academic training, because I went to very good university, then grad school, then studied a ton for the MCAT, so kind of kept me engaged with learning a bit, shadowing doctors, working as an EMT, taking an EMT course, trying to get to be a physician, applying to med schools, and having luck going back to grad school and doing 2 more graduate degrees and almost being done when I got disabled on COVID. I have a lot of years in academia. And there are things to be admired in academia. And mind you, I wasn't trying to be a forever student or something. I was very much trying to just get to be a physician, but I got screwed by certain things with like getting trapped in a rural area after I finished grad school. And I studied biology. You can't find biology jobs in the middle of nowhere. Not like the type of biology I was doing, which is like cell biology, molecular biology, much more laboratory science. You might find an EPA job or something in the middle of nowhere, but not the stuff I was doing. Medical focused biomedical research. You need to be in a city for that, and especially if you're working in the private sector, which most jobs are private sector, unless you want to spend a very long time like committing to a career in academia, and the pay's worse, and you need connections a lot of times to get established there. It's not really possible. Just I got a master's, so you need to do a PhD and then do a postdoc if you're really trying to get jobs in academia. But you can in industry, you can even just with a bachelor's. There's jobs in the pharmaceutical industry. Master's is a little bit of an awkward place because they hire PhDs, they hire bachelor's degrees, but often with a master's, they can see overqualified for the bachelor's stuff and underqualified for PhD. When I finally got out of that rural area, I'd been out of the field for a while. I applied to jobs incessantly. I did manage to get an interview with one company that would consider me for what would normally be a job they put someone with a bachelor's, but with like 3 years experience in, kind of skipping me over that because of my master's. But it was a job you really need the experience. I was like, I'm not sure I'm qualified for this. Can't you consider me for a lower level position? Maybe I was selling myself short, but some things you do need to learn on the job. It was also more engineering, whereas I'm not a biomedical engineer. I'm a biological scientist. So there was also that. Um, but I definitely couldn't have got jobs in my definitely could have gotten jobs in my field if I had not been straying in this rural area after grad school. Just even with my graduate program, Shinedown was in it. Uh, so yeah, I I'm seeing new channels arise on YouTube as they do. Some people saying very clever things about explaining why neoliberalism is flawed, and it's that it's the ideology of the world, but it derives from actually bullshit economics that Hayek and his like cronies pushed, even though they were widely considered to be incompetent and hack economists by their peers. But then some banks and some essentially multimillionaires, billionaires went and funded them, even though they were not respected by their peers because they were incompetent and they were making bullshit assumptions that you can't make about like people being perfectly rational actors, which is bullshit, and the market being completely free with perfect competition. That never happens. Um, so they were making these nonsense assumptions. And most economists sneer them and said, "You're idiots," because they were idiots. This wasn't just arrogance; they were right. But people with a lot of money saw that their ideas could be used to push governments to cut taxes and deregulate and increase their profits and their value of their assets that they held, stocks, investments, so corporations. So the very rich pushed neoliberalism and neoclassical economics, a revival of even though it's absolute bullshit. And now 91% of the economists on the planet are of a neoliberal persuasion, even though the assumptions that neoclassical economics and neoliberal economics make are verifiably false. Neoliberal economics is further development of neoliberal economics. Neoliberal is a further development of neoclassical economics. Yeah, misspoke. Um, really more in terms of, well, if the market is perfectly efficient, then we should start privatizing. It's more of an application that shares the same basic theories and the same basic theories that are wrong. Um, so I watched a good thing on that. As economist, I seen his channel before. That maybe that's just the YouTube algorithm. Not he may have been doing work for a while, but the YouTube algorithm seems to not push left wing content. And when it does, just try and keep you on the same channels over and over and recommend new ones too often. But I saw a good thing on that, and that was new. So and there seem to be new people pop up here and there, but some of the older channels, sometimes they get like co-opted. I think their creators get threatened by the government or they become afraid of like being persecuted or who knows why, but it's a shame. It's why it's so important new channels can take off. And I think it's precisely because this YouTube doesn't push newer left wing content because if you can't control the left wing population if there's constantly whenever you co-opt one like voice just another takes its place, so they try and make it harder for people to take the place of established voices and then co-opt the established ones. I meaning the people who like run YouTube, but broadly speaking the high bourgeoisie, the billionaire class who are you know politicizing social media. I mean, it's inherently a political thing, but they're using it to warp discussions and push their own views and suppress people whose views are not in their interests, like, socialists, obviously. Um, and people pushing anti imperial lines on Ukraine and so forth. Um, anti US lines, broadly speaking, because let's be honest, the US has become the greatest threat to freedom in the world. It is, I mean, sure, there are countries that are less free. There's no question, like, Russia's less free than the United States, but Russia is also a weak ass country that can't really threaten the world. If you think they're this great threat, you've been propagandized to all hell. Their economy is tiny. Their military is outdated. Like, they're not that much of a threat at all. Whereas the US threatens to become unstoppable and it's sliding fascist. So that makes the US the greatest because it's so wealthy, so powerful, such a large military. The US goes fascist, that could lead to fascists conquering the whole planet. So it's a much bigger threat. And that's why the US needs to be weakened at every cost. Um, so I'm not going to sit there and attack countries that are trying to do that, even if they're not great actors, because if we want a multipolar world, the U.S. has to be somewhat weaker for that to even be possible. Mandatar, reach Centaurus A. It's not Alpha Centauri, it's an entire galactic cluster, not a star. Rank 3. The Cigar Galaxy has a Manatar, an extreme neutron star with a magnetic field a trillion times stronger than the Sun's. In 1/10 of a second, emitted a gamma ray burst. The gamma ray burst made news as the first Manatar flare detected outside the Milky Way. What does it mean to be an extreme neutron star? Markarian's chain, which for cluster rank 3. Like the trio of stars in Orion's belt, galaxies tend to travel in packs. Markarian's chain in the Virgo cluster is a parade of 8 galaxies. No, galaxies. I always pissed off and shocked that so many people think the entire universe is just the Milky Way. No, there's other galaxies outside our own. We can observe them. They're quite visible. Galaxies tend to travel in packs. Mercurian's chain in the Virgo cluster is a parade of 8 galaxies moving in concert. They're elliptical or lenticular, like a spiral with no arms, and disturbed to varying degrees. Yeah, it's also, well, it's pretty reasonably strong evidence we're probably humans are probably the only sentient life in the Milky Way. In that we would have been able to detect other sentient life in this galaxy by now, unless it had already gone extinct. I should say the only extant sentient life. It's actually likely there are many extinct sentient civilizations in the Milky Way. There's probably worlds with non-sentient, animal, plant life, besides Earth. Some with just microbial life, some with like trees, some with trees and animals. But actually, there may be other sentient life we wouldn't be able to detect, just not technological civilization, not advanced technological. So there may be like cavemen on other systems where maybe aspects of the climate or wildlife or such on that planet prevent a sentient species from ever going beyond like um, early like Paleolithic kind of technology levels. And there may even be civilizations that have reached like a Iron Age level development and can't go further because maybe the planet lacks, I don't know, coal, oil, certain metals that are necessary for radios. Maybe there's no copper, so copper wiring doesn't work. I mean, you need certain elements to do certain things. It's not like people have this idea of magic. Well, if you research it hard enough, you can make anything happen. No, you can't. Uh, Certain tasks require certain elements. If they're absent from your planet, you just won't be able to say go to space, launch satellites, build radios. So maybe there's other sentient life that's technological but unable to ever become spacefaring. But most likely humans are the only spacefaring species in the Milky Way currently in existence. There may be others. In fact, there probably have been others, but they probably wiped themselves out through nuclear war or climate change or an asteroid slamming into their planet and just destroying their climate. There could be a variety of things that have happened, but it's likely we're the only existing spacefaring species in the Milky Way. However, there are hundreds of, I think thousands of other galaxies. It's likely that most of those have other technological civilizations. Like so far away that it's impossible. Intergalactic travel is nothing but fantasy. Like, even if you could do an Alcubierre drive, which is the one type of warp drive that might be feasible, you would still wouldn't be able to do intergalactic travel. You might be able to travel around the Milky Way, but never leave the galaxy. So, like, someday, maybe very long time from now, the sense of, this Earth civilization that we've got now, if we survive, don't wipe ourselves out thanks to capitalism and climate change, um, nuclear war, because capitalism leads to runaway, like, not handling climate change and instabilities of all sorts, and that can contribute to nuclear war. But if we survive this, and maybe millions, in tens of millions of years down the line, maybe even humans of what solar system, our great 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 whatever descends might detect like radio transmissions, focus beams of exceedingly high power from other galaxies. They might find evidence of life in other galaxies that's, sentient, technological. That'd be really cool. And so far away that it would never be able to directly affect us, really. But one thing we will never likely find is other technological species that are still around in the Milky Way. We may someday reach planets and find like the ruins of a dead civilization. That could happen. In fact, we'd probably find many such ruins. The new place Stellaris, which, by the way, they released a 4.0 and update, and apparently is hot, flaming garbage. So it's right to not just jump into buying the new DLC and hoping for a deeper sale, because I'm broke following COVID, and eventually I'll do a Let's Play of it. But it'd be like in Stellaris, where you can set up your galaxy where there are no other empires creation, but there could be pre-FDL species, which most of which will be like Bronze, Iron Age. If you set it very low, maybe there's a few Iron, Bronze Age civilizations, and you can have signs of a precursor civilizations extinct. Like, that could be our galaxy, basically pre-FTL setting very low, and a dead precursor civilization. And if we ever develop interstellar travel, which you don't even need warp drives, even if it turns out there's no way to ever do that, that could be our concept. If it turns out to be impossible, really, or never practical, we have the capability of doing long generation ship type interstellar journeys. Absolutely, with our current technology, it'd be enormously expensive, mind you. It'd be the kind of thing that the entire human species, the whole planet, would have to be united under one nation and demilitarized largely, and expend enormous amounts of resources, basically a large fraction of the planet's entire GDP for many years to build such a ship. But it's feasible, and technology make it cheaper over time, but it's feasible for humans to reach other star systems and to even colonize them. And it's an inevitability if humans don't wipe themselves out with climate change and such. But just like colonizing Mars is. But of course, my confidence that we won't wipe ourselves out grows lower and lower, because people stubbornly, psychotically refuse to even face the fact that capitalism is an unsustainable system that has to go. Even if that slows GDP growth rates, even if the economy is worse, it's better to have a weaker economy, to be a little bit poor maybe, than is to wipe yourselves out as a species because of climate change that oil companies will never allow sufficiently aggressive action on. And the evidence shows socialism doesn't attain lower GDP growth rates, at least not in the long run. Socialist economies tend to have more steady GDP growth rates. The Soviet Union was a great example of this. The US would have boom years and bust years. Years of really strong economic growth and weak economic growth. In the boom years, the US might grow faster than the Soviet Union, but in the bust years, the Soviet Union grew faster. And in the long run, when you average it out, the Soviets grew faster. 5-year average like 5-year growth rates, like how much did your economy grow percentage wise, comparing the start of a 5-year period and the end. Soviets grew faster consistently until some point in the 70s to the U.S. And that was the end of the Bretton Woods banking system, which I've explained many times if you watch any of the videos on my channel, that Nixon essentially fucked over the whole globe by unilaterally tearing up Bretton Woods, and that fucked over the Soviet Union really hard. It also screwed over the French really hard, which capitalist country, one that leaned more towards social democracy than the United States, but it's not like socialism wasn't uniquely vulnerable to that. It's just the Soviets happened to be in a position where they were vulnerable to that. It's part of why Nixon did it. Of course, he wanted to fuck over the Soviets. Cold War and such. But the U.S. being the dominant power after World War II put them in a position where, essentially power begets power, wealth makes wealth, dominance begets dominance. A country that's already as far ahead as the U.S. was able to have, the entire world banking system based around it. Bretton Woods. But when Bretton Woods was a global banking system that was essentially put under control of the United States, but with certain rules the U.S. had to follow to prevent it from manipulating that system to its advantage or hurting its rivals. And those rules stood until Nixon tore them up. By removing the U.S. from a system where its currency was exchanged at fixed ratios with other currencies and was interchanged at a fixed ratio with gold, which prevented the U.S. from manipulating the value of its currency or other currencies to fuck over its rivals and such. When that system was removed, that's when the whole, by Nixon doing that, he tore the whole system down. He also got, I think there are also rules against certain things the U.S. does now with sanctions. Basically, Nixon tore the system up and declared it free game. But the U.S. the point was, even though the U.S. global banking system was under U.S. control, there were rules that restricted the U.S. from doing things that were unfair, that were torn up under Nixon. But if the U.S. hadn't been the leading power after World War II, it would have never been the one in a position to do that in the first place. If say the Soviets had already been the world's largest economy, but the Soviets had something like 1/13 the GDP per capita of the United States when they formed. They were much poorer. There was no way that in the roughly 20 odd years between the formation and the end of World War II, there was no way they were going to surpass the size of the United States economy. It was impossible for any system anywhere. And turned out that the U.S. being trusted with the global banking system was probably going to guarantee an eventual capitalist victory in the Cold War, which is why, the Cold War never should have happened. It was something that was forced on Americans by Truman, who was a piece of shit and was not legitimately democratically selected. I'm sure you all know that Truman came to power when FDR died in April of 1945. He was vice president. He was not the person that the majority of Democrats or even the majority of Americans wanted or I should say even the majority of Americans, even the majority of Democrats, because his support was stronger among Republicans than it was among Democrats, actually, if I remember, or relatively stronger compared to Wallace, Henry Wallace, who is FDR's vice president from 40 to 44, and something like 70% of Democrats and 50-something% of Americans. So you can see the higher support among Democrats because he was more left-wing than Truman. Even then, the Republicans are the more right-wing party. Henry Wallace was the one that Americans wanted as their vice president in 44. And delegates arrived at the 1944 Democratic Party National Convention, pledged, that is promised, to vote for Wallace. And if the delegates had just voted for the people they person they promised to vote for, Wallace would have been our vice president and then the president when FDR died. Um, but the Democratic Party bosses knew FDR was very sick and didn't want him to live, and they didn't want Wallace to become president. He was anti-racist. I have to point this out, especially because there's another guy named Wallace who was like this conservative Republican, shares the same last name, but it's a fairly common last name in the United States. Completely different politics. Henry Agrid Wallace was someone who wanted to end segregation in 1948 when he ran as a third party candidate against Truman. Um, and he campaigned on ending segregation in the South then and there. He was anti racist. He was anti Cold War. He did not want a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And if he had become president, he would have never started it. The Truman Doctrine is what launched the Cold War. That was something Truman did immediately almost after World War II, before he even won a single election, the 48 election. So he was not, for president anyway, and while he won, of course, the 44 election as FDR's running mate, he was not the one that the Democratic voters or the American people wanted as FDR's running mate. They wanted Wallace. Wallace was the favorite. Most people didn't even know who Truman was. He had like 4% of Democratic voters, or 4% of Americans. I think it was 4% of Americans, maybe a little higher than Democrats, where with the most conservative part of the Democratic Party supported him. So I think it was like 16% among Democrats and 4% among Americans. Very few Americans even knew who Truman was. Those who did tended to despise him. So it's not that only like 16% of people heard of him. It's that a lot of people heard of him, hated him, because he was considered to be anti-union, pro-segregation, a conservative Democrat, corporatist piece of shit. It's interesting because when he actually came to power, he did something of a waffle or an about face on some of these things. He became, maybe in honor of FDR's legacy, less strongly pro-racism and more pro-union. He courted the unions to help get elected in 48. But he never really did in good faith, and he screwed over the unions while pretending to help them, kind of like Biden's done, honestly. He helped pass, he signed the Taft Hartley Hartley, right? He did veto it, actually, first. So I guess he signed it after the veto was overridden, but he gave, maybe it's not entirely fair to blame Taft-Hartley on Truman, but maybe it is, because it's the kind of thing he would have supported before he became vice president or president. So he may have been working behind the scenes to see it passed, and it did happen in his presidency, even though he vetoed it. That forbid secondary strikes. It put serious limits on labor unions in America that kind of tore out the heart out of unionization, and it allowed political persecution of unions if they were suspected communists, which Truman was definitely a virulent anti-communist who was behind the beginnings of the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism. I know other people continued that, but it was Truman who started it. And Taft-Hartley has some anti-communism baked right into it, so that at least somewhat Truman pushing anti-communism gave it more ground than that bill would have had if Wallace had been president, because Wallace supported continued friendship with the Soviet Union, who, reminder, had been allies of the United States in World War II. Supported, staying friends, not suddenly turning on your former friends as soon as the Nazis were defeated, which is what Truman did. Wallace also would not have supported nuking Japan, which was done to threaten the Soviet Union and make them afraid, look, we have nukes. And it was also done so Japan would surrender sooner, not to save American lives, because the Japanese were moving towards surrender, and the U.S. High Command and the President, they knew that Japan was going to surrender, but Japan was going to do it belatedly after, some months of holding out a little longer. And so the alternative was the U.S. talked about a rushed invasion of Japan. It really would have been rushed, which would have cost a lot of lives. But that invasion didn't need to happen because Japan would have surrendered without its home islands being invaded. The reason um, that rushed invasion was being considered under Truman is the same reason the nukes were dropped, is because the U.S. wanted Japan to surrender sooner so that it could obtain more of the Japanese territories that were controlled in Asia, particularly the Korean Peninsula, where Soviet troops allied with Korean resistance fighters were pushing the Korean Peninsula and liberating it from Japanese occupation, because Japan occupied the Korean Peninsula from the 1920s all the way to the end of World War II. And the U.S. didn't want Soviet troops to reach all the way, to march all the way down into Seoul and Busan and just, liberate the whole Korean Peninsula. So because then it would have ended up with a communist government, the whole peninsula. So the U.S. was trying to force Japan to surrender early enough to get a puppet government in charge in the southern half of the Korean Peninsula, which is exactly what happened. South Korea was originally a U.S. puppet government that was a direct continuation of the Japanese colonial government. In fact, a lot of administrators of Korean birth who had worked with the Japanese for those 20 odd years, collaborators, were kept in power in the government that was founded in South Korea. These were known as shit. I forgot that there's a derogatory Korean term for them, but I can look it up if some of you are really interested. If you leave a comment or something, I've talked about this term before in videos, I believe, but maybe that was back in my Reddit days. But it's yeah, it's something that these people were despised and they were kept in power by most Koreans because the Japanese instituted a reign of terror in the Korean Peninsula, and they were kept in power by the United States so that the U.S. could keep communists down because communism was gaining widespread support because they offered um, a means of liberation from Japanese colonial occupation. Um, the Soviets, even before they got involved in World War II, provide some covert support for the communists. The communists thus were able to provide real fighting and resistance and support against the Japanese, so that made them very popular. And the Japanese colonial administration responded to rising support for communism in the Korean Peninsula by secret police and hunting down and murdering anyone who sympathized with the communists. So these kind of people who had engaged in that reign of terror were kept in power by the U.S. No respect for freedom of speech or freedom of opinion or quote marketplace ideas. Those are all lies when the U.S. claims to believe in it. It's really sad that people think that any of that's in good faith. It's not. The United States just uses those as excuses to dominate countries. Um, but yeah, if Wallace had been president, the United States would not have nuked Japan, would not have invaded Japan either. It would have World War II would have ended several months later. Uh, the entire Korean Peninsula would have been a united country under a communist government. There would have not been a Korean War. There would have not been the Truman Doctrines. There would have never been the Berlin airlift or any of that either, because the Soviets wouldn't have felt threatened by American co-occupation of Berlin, because Berlin, as part of the Alta Conference, was split up between American and Soviet occupation zones, which Americans were somehow brainwashed and thinking the Soviets had just taken over parts of the city. It was some kind of violation. No, this had always been the agreement. Um, Soviets had every right to be there in Berlin. The Americans technically did too, but the Americans started operating CIA paramilitary operations out of that foothold in Berlin into East Germany, and that pissed the Soviets off. So they cut off all access of food or supplies into Berlin, and that's what led to the Berlin airlift. A Soviet response to American covert aggression out of Berlin. CIA spy stuff going on, which the U.S. government will still deny happened, but the Soviet accusations of this are quite credible because this is par for the course for the U.S. This is the kind of thing the U.S. does all the time. Why would the U.S. It has done things like that before? Will do things like that in the future. Why would it be hard to believe had done it in the past? Yeah. Current and more recent past behavior is a pretty good indication these accusations are probably true. Um, and the Soviets certainly believed they were true, even if they weren't. So yeah, they tried to force America to withdraw from Berlin. That was the whole Berlin airlift, but that would have never happened if it had been Wallace, because the Soviets wouldn't have felt threatened by a Wallace-led America the same way they did by Truman's uh, led America. Um, no Korean War. A lot of people would have not been killed in horrific ways, by the way, because one thing many people aren't aware is that the Korean War was the first widespread usage of napalm. It was used, all right, at considerable scale in the end days of World War II, but in the Korean War, the United States killed 2 to 3 million people in North Korea, primarily through firebombing with napalm and just dropping so much conventional ordnance in the country that there were, quote, no more targets. The leading English historian on the period calls this a genocide by the United States because that's what it was. It was essentially an attempt to wipe out an entire population, entire civilian population, because they dared to resist the U.S. empire. That's genocide. Um, and never would have happened under Wallace. There would have not been a Korean War. There would not have been the puppet government in South Korea that led to the Korean War, which, by the way, that government, although it was, quote, invaded by North Korea, there were already 100,000 people who died due to massacres by the South Korean government within South Korean held territory before the war broke out, and there have been numerous border skirmishes instigated mainly by the South Korean government. South Korean government was conducting cross-border raids into North Korea. So they, uh, how would I say it? Aggravated, provoked. They provoked the North Korean invasion by quite literally sending soldiers across the border into North Korea dozens of times and killing North Korean soldiers and attacking, military installations and such. You can't launch cross-border raids on a country over and over and over and expect that country isn't going to eventually invade you, especially if it's a case of two countries that really should be one country, Korea, and your government's a puppet regime of a foreign power, which Rhee's South Korea was very much a U.S. puppet regime. Sung Young Rhee, or whatever, I forget the name of him, but he was educated in the United States. He rubbed elbows like senators for years and years before he was basically airlifted into South Korea to take over the puppet regime there. He was a U.S. puppet. There's no question about that. Nowadays, South Korea has a lot more independence and can be considered a nation that can make its own decisions to some degree, although there's still a huge U.S. military presence in the Korean Peninsula that limits South Korean sovereignty to a degree. But back then, there's zero question South Korea was absolutely a U.S. puppet. And it was aggressive. It was like a little dog with a big bite, even though it didn't have a strong military. It was doing these cross-border raids because it knew it could count on Big Daddy America to back it up if North Korea attacked, which was a puppet regime, because if it didn't think it could count on U.S. help, if it managed to provoke North Korea into attacking, they would have never been doing these cross-border raids. It would have been suicidally stupid to attack a much stronger, more economically powerful nation, because the North Korean economy was much larger than the South Korean economy at this time, and was until like at some period in the 70s, about somewhere after the end of Bretton Woods, is when the South Korean economy finally surpassed the size of the North Korean. You wouldn't attack a more militarily, more economically powerful country that had already some reasonable causes to invade you because of, the country being divided into and country being divided into rightfully being one country, like It'd be like if the U.S. had broken up into the Confederate States and the Union, and it didn't immediately provoke a war, and then the Confederates started doing cross-border raids in the Union. It would have been suicidally dumb if they didn't say, if they were to do that and say they didn't have a larger power protecting them. Yeah. And so North Korea took the bait. Maybe they shouldn't have taken the bait, but they did, and to claim it was completely unprovoked, completely unprovoked aggression is a lie. It's a lie that the CIA and shit would have you believe, but it's not based in reality. Um, anyways, enough. I've had enough shooting down Voice of America bullshit propaganda and talking about the drift right words of a leftist YouTuber, and I don't know how I'm trying to get the hell out of this country before I get hunted down as a leftist and like deported, even though I'm like a 16th generation American, because Trump is a fascist and he will send, white Americans whose ancestors have been in this country forever to his death camps. The Seekai is basically a death camp because the conditions there are so bad that people die. Um, it's a concentration camp because he's saying people there without fair trial based on identity that meets the definition of a concentration camp. And specifically, it's actually a death camp because the conditions there are so bad. Like, people are kept in a single room with 70 people 23 and a half hours a day. The lights are never turned off. That leads to, terrible nutrition and such. People are going to die of malnutrition. They're going to die of disease due to overcrowding and, contagious diseases spreading like wildfire in such conditions. That's a death camp. And oh yeah, they sleep on metal bunks with no sheets, no mattresses. That's going to lead to sores, which are going to get infected. It's a death camp. And that's where Trump is sending legal U.S. residents. If you doubt the U.S. is turning fascist, he, I didn't think he would be this dumb. I thought it'd be a more subtle march to fascism. No, this is literally deporting permanent residents to death camps. It's pretty fucking obvious. Um, I'm just surprised. I guess I shouldn't be that ordinary Americans aren't doing more, standing up about this. Are people scared? Are they just too stupidly complacent? I don't know. Um, because after Trump comes for the Latinos, he's coming for you next. Whoever you are, you think you're safe, but this is a first they came for type situation. First, they came for the communists, but I was not a communist, so I did not speak up. Then they came for the socialists, but I was not a socialist, so I said nothing. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I was not a trade unionist. That's literally the poem, by the way. It starts with first. They came for the communists, but that version is omitted in many versions of the poem, that line, because anti-communism and Cold War. Um, and it's the historical order the Nazis came for different groups. They started off coming for the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany, and attacking their offices and arresting their leaders, deporting some people who were permanent residents. Then they came for the socialist parties, the more militant part of the SPD. No, SPD, yes, Social Democratic Party of Deutschland, which Deutschland means Germany in German. So then they came for the more militant wing of the SPD and other minor socialist parties. Then they came for trade unions, especially militant trade unions. Then they came for Romas, gypsies, homosexuals, and Jews. Oh yeah, and they also came for the disabled very early on, which is not even in that poem, but um, something I have to worry about if someone is disabled. I mean, that was more like people in wheelchairs, missing limbs from World War One, and people born, air quote, this is not the correct term for, but retarded or mentally disabled. That those were the people Nazis came for first. But I mean, there was no such thing as long COVID then, or I bet they would have came for those people too. So I'm sure the MAGA fucks will come for me eventually, which is why I'm trying to get out of this country. But If you haven't, subscribe to the channel. Like, subscribe. Go check out some of my gaming videos. They're a little more laid back than this. My other gaming videos. This is a fucking gaming video, but it's a clicker, so it's almost like a politics video. Because what am I doing? I'm clicking stuff. There's very little to think about, so I talk to fill the, silence the gaps. Maybe I shouldn't. Consider it. I sometimes give myself like, maybe if I talked less politics, I get more subscribers. I don't know, but these things are very important. Maybe I'd have a better chance of surviving, but maybe other people would have less chance of surviving then, because there'd be less opposition to Trump, and he'd be in a more of a position to. Every little bit helps, even if I'm hardly the biggest or most important voice. Every voice of resistance, of opposition to fascism, puts Trump in a little bit of a weaker place where he's less able to, deport people who he has no right to deport to death camps in El Salvador and beat protesters and all these other horrendous things he's doing. It's fine. The Democrats may have done more to beat protesters in Gaza, but there's still that still going on. It's just the media's not talking about it as much. So, the media credit, I mean, usually the media will talk more about this stuff when a Republican's in charge, but this time they actually talk more about it when Democrat, because it was happening more under Biden. But that's because Trump would prefer to deport and basically murder people who speak out about Gaza than just beat them. Anyways, that's enough. I wish you folks all the best. Take care of each other. Be kind to yourselves. May you always find a guiding star to lead you home. Until next time, this is Northstar. Best wishes. Till next time, adieu.